here. Let me just get started. We have first talk. We're actually on time according to the schedule. So today we're going to have, first of all, Branislav Slantchev, who's going to talk on war finance and coercive bargaining. So you have to one or two.
Okay.
Then we'll have discussion, about 15-minute discussion after that.
Well, thanks for inviting me. It's been actually a few years since I've been here, and it's always a pleasure to drive up from San Diego. As we were talking a little bit over lunch, there's been an interesting sort of convergence between political science and economics in a way that economists have discovered the importance of power and coercion in not just voluntary exchange, and some of the political scientists have suddenly discovered that, well, economics matters. I mean, we should have known this for a while. So I'm very happy because now you can get comments from two disciplines, and hopefully that would improve our state of knowledge. I myself have been interested in international conflict, and especially in the coercive use of force. So basically military threats, and how do you deal with crisis and crisis bargaining. And I've been doing this for a few years, and you can think of, if you look at the literature, how it's developed, you start with the simple use of threats, and you take the power as a given, and then we've gradually realized that power itself is a variable, and it's a result of choices governments make, for instance, how much to pay, how much to mobilize, how much of their resources to dedicate to military capabilities that might be useful down the road in some sort of bargaining and coercive situations. And that's where I've been slowly drifting into these issues of economics. And what I was teaching this course on IR history, actually, and we've covered many wars, and I was, of course, kind of reading up on war finance, because it was interesting, how do governments really pay for these incredibly costly endeavors? And of course, as we all know, there's generally two ways, primarily, that they pay, is taxations or they borrow money. And unfortunately, with now theories of war, none of this sort of thing is present. We sort of take the resources as a given or as fixed. So we don't even know what effect, and this is what I'm trying to study, is whether how you pay for your military resources is going to affect how you behave subsequently in a crisis bargaining situation. So let me just give you a very short kind of snapshot of how you usually pay for war. There's several ways. One, you can have a hoard of cash, a war chest, and you can go to war on this. And it's been known to happen. It's very rare that governments actually have the money, or they really run out of resources very fast. So Frederick the Great is a great example. When he invaded Silesia, well, he did so on a hoard of money that his predecessor had accumulated. He wiped it out within less than a year, even though he thought that he had enough to go around and throw his way around. He got himself involved in a war that nearly wiped out the Prussian state. So usually that kind of source is either they don't have it or it doesn't last very long. So it's not very important. Another way you can think about this is you can, okay, well, how do we pay for the war? We make war pay for itself. We start the war, we conquer some territory, and we start exploiting it, use these resources to pay for continuance of the war. And of course, you can just plunder, or you can enslave part of the population. Of course, the most notorious example of this would be the Nazis during World War II, that they both plundered and kind of put the population that they, in the territories they covered to work for them. Or you can sort of do taxation, contributions, forced contributions on the territories you have. And this was perfected during the 30 Years' War, for instance, when Wallenstein was very famous for occupying territories and essentially acting as the tax authority. And in fact, the contributions that he was levying on the villages usually would mimic the pre-war contributions, the taxes they were paying to the usual overlords. So it was kind of interesting. The thing is,
I think the Romans were doing both.
Yes, I'm just giving some examples here. The thing is, the Nazis are usually held up as being most effective in this, but if you actually look at the data, they were not. The Germans were paying a huge proportion of the war effort. Actually, by some estimates, the Germans were paying the highest proportion in terms of the national product of all the other belligerents, with the possible exception of the Soviet Union during World War II. And that's despite the Nazis' ability to extract so much from the conquered territories. And of course, most of the time, you don't have access to these vast territories we can plunder. So this doesn't work very well. It also introduces, I discussed this in the paper, introduces a lot of agency problems with your people rampaging and pissing off the population and continuing the unrest. So politically maybe not a good idea to do this. Well, you can rely on somebody else's paying you to fight their wars. Now, the British are very famous for funding various sorts of continental coalitions against continental powers, so they pay the Prussians to go against the French, no matter who is on if it's a Bourbon on the throne, or some Napoleon, or some revolutionary government. The British are always kind of the paymasters. The problem with this is, I mean, it's great if it works, and it's just hard usually to find a conflict that somebody would be interested in paying you to fight on their behalf, and of course then you have to also take their interest into account, so you lose some of your flexibility in what you can extract from this. And as usual, this kind of funding source is very vulnerable to domestic politics in the source country. So the British would promise money, but usually would not be able to deliver, depending on parliamentary debates. The French would subsidize things against the British. Obviously here in the US, they paid them for some revolution, help some revolution along. So it was going back and forth, but of course it really depended on the domestic politics in the source country. And it's not readily available for most conflicts. Another way you can pay, you can manipulate the money supply. Of course, before paper currency, you can just debase the currency, reduce the content of valuable metal in the currency, or more recently, you can just start printing money. My favorite example of this running amok is during the French Revolution, when they printed so many of these assignats there that the floor of the printing house actually collapsed under the weight of the bills. It's just so reckless. And of course, they lose value very quickly. Nobody trusts the currency anymore, so you kind of lose all the point of having the money because nobody wants to use it. So the two most actually common methods is you can tax. And my initial, when I went into this, I thought taxation is how you normally would pay for war. And what I found out, this is actually not the case. What really happens is that you actually tend to get most of your finances for war historically by borrowing. What happens is this is true even for the British, which are usually held up as an example of having a very efficient tax apparatus, especially after the Glorious Revolution. They developed a very good bureaucracy for collecting taxes, and the British subjects were usually actually subject to taxes to levels that the continental Europeans can only dream of. And even these guys managed to essentially run up, despite the high level of taxation, the way the Brits financed most of their wars, as I should show you very briefly here, is by borrowing. The reason they were able to borrow so well is because they would tie the taxes to repaying the debt. So after the war, they would pay by essentially the taxes paying the debt. So during the war, you do not want to increase taxation usually, because, as Louis XIV repeatedly found out, you do this, and the peasants tend to rebel. They don't like this. So what you want to do is kind of alleviate the immediate burden, and then spread it out after the war, stretch it out over a period of time. So usually what they do is tax just enough in order to pay the interest on the loans that they incurred during the war. And usually if you read the discussions, even in the US, that's the interest. Should we raise taxes just enough so we can pay interest and attract more loans? Forget about amortizing the principal, we'll just do this after the war. And of course there's several ways, and here in this, today I'll be talking about the debt essentially financing war through borrowing. Why focus on borrowing? It's a very, very common method. And here in the paper I have more examples, but here just let me give you an example of the Brits, because again, they're very famous for this. Here are some big wars in which they were involved through the 17th and 18th century. And these are in millions of pounds. This is spending per year during the war. So here, the 9 Years' War, they would spend £5 million per year of the war, and a debt at the end would be £16 million. And as you can see, two trends. First, the cost of war go up over time, and second, the debt at the end of the war is just mushroom, especially after the American Revolution. It was an extremely costly endeavor for the British. So as you can see, essentially it's deficit finance during the war, and of course this is precisely why Jefferson, of all people, opposed the ability of the government to borrow money, because he thought that hid the cost of the war from the people, so made them more belligerent. And it's precisely because why Hamilton supported it, because he thought it enabled the countries to actually fight the wars and win them. A more recent example is World War I, which was almost entirely fought on credit. And here, let me just give you some of the major belligerents to see what's happening. Germany, basically every year it would be spending, so the average is about 24 billion marks. that they spent on war, and its deficit was about 26 billion per year. So basically, it's all fought on borrowed money. The Germans were very good because at the end, they managed to repudiate most of the debt, essentially by inflating it away, and they managed to even evade paying most of the reparations. So in terms of how cheap the war was, they actually did, as we shall see, kind of better than even the British in the end.
I mean, the deficit might be that big, but it might not be borrowed. It might be actually inflation. What you said.
Right. It wasn't. They
printed a lot of money.
Right. No, actually they didn't. Inflation was not as high. I actually have the figures for the actual debt in the paper. It was partially by printing money, but mostly it was borrowed, and it was domestic borrowing that they did. They essentially just sold, every year they would have a public a bond sale, the government bonds, just like all the others actually. Austria's war debt, average 85% of GDP throughout the war. France went from basically zero deficit before the war. Its deficit went to 40% of GDP, and this is despite the introduction of income tax during the war. So it did barely make a dent. And Britain is most famous here, probably. It started from a pretty high debt, 26% of GDP. By the war's end, it had mushroomed to 128% in 1919. Now, these may not be huge, and this is the debt, actually. This may not seem high by today's standards. Today, we heard some numbers in the 200% of GDP of public debt. At the time, that was huge, right? So these were some significant figures here. So an important method, essentially, that's what I'm trying to convince you. Borrowing money is an important method to finance the war. Borrowing has some features that are very specific to it. First of all, what about repaying the debt? Now, in general, nothing really can force a government to honor the debt except what happens if they don't. And through, again, my reading of this was that in general, governments do make genuine efforts to repay the debt, because if they don't, their ability to borrow in the future may be impaired. And in fact, in the competition, for instance, in the 17th and 18th century between France and Britain, at least, if you look at the post-war behavior, essentially it was a competition in fiscal reconstruction. Who's going to repay their debt faster so they can borrow more and get at each other again? Some people have characterized the rivalry this way. So they do not kind of repudiate the debt willy-nilly. But, of course, there is a risk that the government will not honor its obligations. And there are several ways you can do this. You can just declare default and just cancel the loans you have. You can restructure them, basically force better terms in your favor, or you can inflate them away. Just print some money and just reduce the value, the cost of repaying the debt. And that happens. And it happens in particular when the governments are in dire financial trouble, usually as a result of defeat in a war. Because that's when you either have to pay reparations, that puts a debt in your ability to pay the people that lent you the money, because you lose some territory, you lose valuable economic resources, so this really curtails your ability to meet your obligations. So the way I'm thinking about this is these are the crucial features, and we want to think about how that finance is going to impact crisis bargaining. How do we incorporate this in our theories of crisis bargaining? So as a rule, our theories, as I started out saying, do not really consider war finance. It's just a black box. There's some parameter usually that summarizes the distribution of power, or at best, and this is a recent kind of development, you kind of decide how much of your resources to divide between guns and butter. The ones you dedicate to guns determine the distribution of power endogenously. But even this, with explicit military allocations, we don't have a lot of work on where these resources come from, at least not in the literature that I deal with. And there's virtually nothing on actually borrowing to fund these military expenditures. In the paper I cite, there's a couple of things there, but essentially nothing that has the features that I want. And these are the features that I would like to see. First of all, if we're going to study debt finance, we want to have endogenous military allocations to begin with that determine the distribution of power. I'm going to, in order to be able to relate the effects of this financing to things that we know about, I'm going to start with bargaining over divisible good, because these models are very well developed. We know very well the dynamics in these types of models, how threats work there. We're going to impose some resource constraints, so we give people the incentive to actually borrow money, right? And you can expand your resource constraint by borrowing some. And we're going to introduce what I kind of empirically, informally observed historically, that there's a possibility of debt repudiation, and this possibility is greater in defeat than it is in victory. So this is what I'll do. And what we'll see here, it's a model with complete information with just 2 players. And what I will show you is that with endogenous mobilization resources and without the ability to borrow, peace will always prevail. Because, as we shall see, the usual setup occurs, which is war is very inefficient because it destroys things. It's a very inefficient way to divide resources. With complete information and absent commitment problems and care about future changes in power, there's no reason not to be able to divide the good today. And then I will say, okay, well, when we allow players to borrow in order to increase their military capacity, we'll find 2 things. First of all, there's going to be a coercive use of debt. You will borrow money when your existing resources are not enough for you to get a good deal peacefully, so you will borrow some money, extract a better deal, then repay the debt. And overall, you're better off, although from perspective of the 2 players, this money that goes to a third party that lent you the money is kind of wasted. It's a part of the pie it's not available to either of the 2 players anymore. And more importantly, under certain conditions, we will find that even with complete information, a player would incur unsustainable debt, knowing that incurring this debt would plunge them into war. It will make bargaining impossible, essentially. What will happen here is that it will wipe out the entire bargaining range. You will incur a debt at this level that will make no deal preferable to fighting. And the reason I think this is important is because it provides an explanation of war which is new to this bargaining literature. And this, the new explanation, as we'll explain, comes from the inefficiency of peace that comes from having to borrow the money to pay for the war effort. So let me explain how this works. Here's the simple structure of the model. We have 2 risk-neutral players, and they're going to be bargaining over the distribution of benefit, and the size of the benefit is normalized to 1. And the model will have 2 phases. The first one is the military preparation phase, and the second one is the bargaining and consumption phase. And so we start with an existing distribution of these resources, where player 1 has some Y share, and 1 minus Y belongs to player 2. Player 1 can incur some debt. He can borrow some amount or nothing. You don't have to borrow anything. And given this debt, which both players observe, they simultaneously decide how much resources to mobilize. And the idea is that for player 2, they can mobilize any resources up to the share you have. The same thing for player 1. The share plus the debt is incurred is the new resource constraint, and I introduce some efficiency parameter, how efficient you are at converting your resources to military for player 1. So this is how you can mobilize. After they've mobilized, this is all observable, they enter the second phase. And in the second phase, they bargain. And the payoffs are simple. If they achieve, if they agree on some distribution, efficient distribution of the good between them, player 1 is going to get his share of the agreed upon distribution, and he's committed to repaying the debt. For now, assume there's no interest accruing to the debt. Later in the paper, I relax this. And player 2 simply gets her share of the price. So this is the payoff in peace. And if they go to war, war is costly, so a share of the good is going to be destroyed. So the winner is going to get some pi, which is less than 1. So with the probability, which is, as I shall note, it's endogenous, it's determined simply by the military investments here, player 1 is going to win, in which case, if he wins, he's committed again to repaying the debt. So he's going to get whatever remains of the pie that was not destroyed, and he has to pay the debt back. So this is his expected payoff. If he loses, he repudiates the debt, and it gets nothing, so 0 payoff. And player 2, if she wins, she simply gets the share. She hasn't borrowed any money, she doesn't care. So this is it. So that's the simple setup. Notice here that in the first, consumption only occurs after they fight or negotiate. So I've abstracted away from the guns versus barrel trade-off in the first period. It's not much of an interest here. So that's the setup. All right, so how do we think about this? How do we model the bargaining? I'm not actually interested in what precise types of bargains that we're going to get. What I want to know is whether they'll be able to find any peaceful bargains. So to do this, what I want to find is a sufficient condition that will preclude any possible peaceful bargain after the arming decisions. So you say, okay, well, each player can always guarantee its expected payoff from war. So they will not be they will only accept bargains that are at least as good. So player 1 wouldn't fight if his payoff from the negotiated deal is at least as good as the payoff from war. Same for player 2. And this gives us the bargaining range, as usual. And I say, if the bargaining range exists, I will simply assume that the solution is the Nash bargaining solution. They basically will split whatever's in this range in half. Everybody gets the expected payoff from war plus the little bit that's in this range. Is the usual thing. And this, of course, gives us the sufficient condition for war is that this bargaining range doesn't exist. Right? So it's impossible to simultaneously satisfy both of these constraints. And this leads us to a definition. Basically, if the debt is higher than the surplus to be divided, then the bargaining range will not exist and war would be inevitable. So now the question is, if this is the case, would you ever incur debt at this level that will wipe out the bargaining range? And I'll explain how this is quite different from the way we usually model these things, how we think about war, the causes for war in a setup like this. So, before we continue, first of all, war here is still inefficient. In fact, it's more inefficient than in the usual setup, because not only you only get, if you sum up the expected war payoffs, in the usual setup you get the pie, so it's the share of the pie that is not destroyed by fighting, which is always less than the pie. Here you always get, with some probability, somebody will have to pay back the debt, so you have to subtract this, so it's even less efficient than in the usual scenario. But unlike the usual scenario, peace is also inefficient. Because in peace, you're committed to repaying the debt. So if you add the payoffs from peace for the two players, they also sum up to less than the pie. And that's a major difference between this model and the usual ones. So very quickly, it's a complete information model. So we start and say, okay, what kind of, first of all, what kind of debt can you ever expect in any equilibrium? And it's very easy to show, and I do so in the paper, that you will never borrow more than what you expect to get if a war is fought. And you win, basically, you will never pay more than this, because otherwise all your payoffs are going to be negative. So that's very easy. The second one is because there is no guns versus butter trade-off in the first period, you're looking at a situation in which, well, how much are you going to mobilize? Well, since your payoff from peace and from war is increasing in your military allocation, you always allocate, basically you mobilize everything you have, given your resource constraint. Again, this is because there's no consumption trade-off in the first period. The only tricky part here is that it is interesting to see why player 2 would do this. For player 1, he's already incurred the debt, right? So he's looking essentially at his resource constraint. When peace or war, he always gets a positive payoff. And in fact, the more he invests, the more the possibility of his probability of winning improves. And actually, it can create peace, as I show there. So you can never do badly if you're player 1 by investing a lot. Well, with player 2, it's a little bit more interesting. It's because as she improves her probability of winning, she may actually wipe out the bargaining range. And what I have to show, and this is what the proof of dilemma does, is that she will, in fact, go all the way up, even if doing so would cause war. So with these two lemata, it's very easy now, because we know that whatever the debt is, they're going to mobilize at the maximum level as possible. So we can solve, and this game turns out to have two solutions. Two optimal debt levels. Is going to be a unique solution in equilibrium. Two optimal debt levels depending on whether the continuation game is going to end in peace or in war. So if you think, if the continuation is going to end in peace, there's an optimal level for peace, and you get your bargaining range and you split the surplus. And if it's going to end in war, you have another expression. There's a unique optimal level of debt precisely for fighting, if you expect to fight after this. And the big thing is that if you expect to fight, you always borrow more. Why? Well, because you only expect to have to repay this if you win, not if you lose. So you always have an incentive to jack up your spending. And now the question is...
What if we have reparations to pay? We have to pay more than you borrowed.
Well, I'm assuming you're basically out of the picture as government. You don't care, right? So your payoff if you lose is just zero. Again, if reparations, sure. All I need here to get this is that your probability of repudiating the debt is higher in defeat than it is in victory, and you can get this. And I just made it normalize it to zero.
Priced there?
I'm sorry, what?
In the event of war, do you have the debt properly priced? So if I'm going to lend to you, and there's a chance I will not be paid back.
Yeah, this is the extension when I will talk about what kind of interest you'll have to pay in order to attract the lending. Yeah. Here is just, you just repay, and actually they sometimes do this. Often the governments would refuse to pay any interest, That just what happens to the Germans in the reparations. That's part of the debt. Part of the reparations after World War I involved paying interest, but the bulk of this, actually, more than half of this, was simply you would be amortizing the principal with no interest. And they even reneged on that one. But, so it's not that far-fetched. But in the extension here, debt servicing, I will talk about this question. So the question is, all right, if we have these two expressions, but will it be the case that in equilibrium, you would ever incur this debt and actually cause war with complete information? And it turns out, okay, there are some necessary and sufficient conditions for war. And it's very easy to read. Basically, there's two conditions. First of all, remember, theta is how efficient player one is at converting the resources he has into military capabilities. And player one should be relatively inefficient in converting, so theta should be less than this here, and I'll explain what exactly it means and how to think about this parameter. And the debt must be sufficiently high for the bargaining range to close. There's a critical value of the debt. If the debt ever exceeds this, the bargaining range will be wiped out. So if you look at this, first of all, the efficiency. One thing to note, if the cost of war become very small, meaning that pi, what remains after the fighting, goes to 1, this parameter is going to go to 0. So actually, this is not going to be a very binding condition. Similarly, if y, which is your pre-war resource base, if it goes to 0 itself, then this theta is just going to be 1 minus pi. So I will show you some dynamics here that will tell you under what conditions these will be satisfied for sure, and we will get war in equilibrium. But for now, two things. You have to be relatively inefficient, and you have to incur a sufficiently high debt. All right, so in the unique subgame perfect equilibrium, I find actually the conditions that are sufficient to guarantee war. And let me illustrate it with a graph, actually, it would be easiest to see. So, war cannot be avoided if the cost of war is sufficiently small and the pre-war distribution of resources is sufficiently unfavorable for player one. Meaning, mobilizing from his existing resource base is not going to give player one sufficient capability, right? So he needs to borrow money in order to get a good deal. But the problem is, because he's not very efficient in converting his resources, he has to borrow a lot in order to achieve anything. And as we shall see, borrowing too much makes player two unwilling to satisfy his demands peacefully anymore. The interesting thing, first of all, to see here is that without any debt, in this model, war will never occur. Right? So there's a big difference with the existing model. The only way you can get is because of this condition here, is that the debt has to be sufficiently high. So here's how this works. Here's an example in which player one controls 5% of the pre-war capabilities, and after the war, basically the war will destroy 15% of the pie, so only 85% will remain. So with this, what will happen? Here is the player one's efficiency, the theta parameter that I mentioned. And here first is the optimal peace debt, is this graph. And this line here is the optimal war debt. So what you would borrow if you're going to go to war. And what I bolded the equilibrium debt that you will incur. So as you can see, first of all, if you're very, very inefficient, if you're very, very efficient at converting your resources, that is very, very low, then peace will prevail. Why? Well, because you don't need to borrow a whole lot. You're very efficient at converting it. You can improve your capabilities relatively easily by borrowing a small amount of money. And because it's a small amount of money, player two is willing to give you a concession that is necessary for you to repay this amount you borrowed peacefully. Because remember, you have to get enough money from player two so you can satisfy your war payoff and return the debt. If you're extremely inefficient, you will also not borrow. In this case, you will borrow nothing. Because you're so inefficient that even if you borrowed and you provoked war, your inability to convert this into useful military resources tells you that you're just going to end up with a very bad war payoff anyway. So you just don't borrow anything, you settle with whatever you can get given your existing resources. And here in the middle is where the bad thing happens. If you're kind of moderately efficient, meaning that you're not efficient enough to get away with a small debt. You have to borrow a lot of money. But this amount of money could be useful in helping you militarily if war occurs. You would incur actually this debt, and as you can see, it can be pretty high here. And because it's so high, player 2 is unwilling to give you a deal that would satisfy your war constraint and enable you to repay the debt in peace. So that's what happens in this region. That's where you can get war. So let me illustrate a little bit the two possibilities. So let's consider first what I call the coercive use of debt, that you borrow in order to extract a better deal from the other player. So consider a situation where you're relatively efficient, so theta equal to 0.35 is somewhere here, so in the peace region. If you're relatively efficient, so this here is what you would get if you do not incur any debt, if you're player 1. This is the payoff you get if you do incur the debt. This is for player 2's payoff if player 1 doesn't incur any debt, and this is player 2's payoff if player 1 does incur the debt. Without debt, over here you will get essentially 19% of the pie. And player 2 is going to get the remainder, 81. So efficient distribution. There's no debt, so they sum up to 100%. By borrowing, player 1 can improve his payoff, so actually it will go up to 30% of the pie. Right? This is after he's repaid the debt. Notice that player 2 will only get back 49% of the pie. There's 21% that are going to go to repaying the debt. Right? So if you sum up these guys' payoffs, they do no longer sum up to the size of the pie. But notice that player 1 can improve how much he gets even after repaying the debt. So he's been able to coerce player 2, and player 2 gets to make some significant concessions. And notice that her concession is big enough to give player 1 a better share and enable him to repay the debt. And that's the trick, and that's why it won't work if your player 1 demands even more money because he's relatively inefficient, so he has to incur an even higher debt. So let's see what happens if they actually are going to be not being able to find actually a peaceful solution to this. If player 1 is relatively inefficient, so theta equal 1, so we're somewhere over here, again, without debt, player 1 is going to get like 12% of the pie in peace. Again, because he's relatively inefficient in converting his resources, so obviously his share will depend on his expected war payoff, is going to be lower here. By borrowing, he can improve it a little bit, up to 15%. The debt he incurs here is huge, actually. As we shall see, it's like 30% of the pie or something is wasted in terms of how much money he has to borrow. And because he has to borrow so much, player 2 becomes unwilling to make the concession. That's the trick. So the question is, why borrow for war instead of for peace? What's happening here? So let's do some counterfactual analysis. Again, take theta equal 1, as I showed here. And notice that at this level, with theta equal 1, the best player 1 can do without provoking war, if you look at this graph, theta equal 1, the optimal peace-inducing debt is somewhere here, which is 1.6, actually. It's not very clear, but it's 1.6. The resulting distribution of power is just going to be 16% chance of victory for player 1, and the expected payoff from peace for player 1 would be this number there, 13.5% of the pie. With the optimal war debt, he can improve his probability of winning up to 28%, right? And of course, because the debt, he's incurring a debt, and because war is costly, the improvement in the expected payoff is not that huge, but there is an improvement. It will go up to 15%. The problem is that with this distribution of power, player 2 is unwilling to make the concession necessary to meet this demand. It's because player 2 would not concede more than 39%. And the reason for this, if you compute her expected payoff, basically 1 minus 28 is her probability of winning is going to be, what is it, 72%. So 72% of the pie, 85, essentially ends up being exactly around, let's see, 61%. So she would not concede more than 39% to player 1. Out of this 39%, player 1 has to repay, if they're going to agree peacefully, 33 of the debt he's incurred, leaving him with a payoff of only 6%, which is much, much worse than his payoff from war. And that's the problem. The problem is that player 2's concession has to enable him to repay the debt if he's going to end up the interaction peacefully. That's why he has to borrow for war rather than for peace. And again, the intuition is simple. It's player's moderate effectiveness that enables this situation to occur. He's effective enough to make military use of the resources, but not effective enough so he can do this at a low cost. So the cost that the money he must borrow is so huge, but the concomitant decrease in player 2's expected payoff is not big enough to enable her to agree to actually these deals that will enable player one to repay the debt. All right, so how do we interpret this? Well, somebody could think, and this is what I thought, maybe this is a type of commitment problem. The reason here is that there might be a commitment problem is that after the debt is incurred, they cannot commit not to mobilize all the way up to the maximum, right, in order to extract better deals. So what if player two, and remember, as I said initially, it's player two's mobilization that can provoke war. If she mobilizes at the low enough level, the bargaining range will always exist. But if she goes all the way up, she might wipe it out. So why would she do this? So suppose she would agree to limit her mobilization. So the player one has borrowed some amount of money, they start mobilizing, and player one agrees to limit her mobilization. How do we think of this without rewriting the whole thing? Well, if you express the probability of winning from the maximum military allocations, it reduces to this expression. So this is player one's resource constraint, and this is player two's resource constraint multiplied by theta. So you can think of theta times player two's resource constraint as kind of the effective unit of resources committed by player two to the fight. So you can kind of mimic the decision to commit less than the full amount by just taking smaller values of theta and see what happens. And because, again, at smaller values of theta, each unit of resources committed by player one, its value is going to be increasing because essentially player two's resources are going to be limited. So let's see. We start and say, okay, let's take our original model. Let's suppose theta equals 0.5, so it's somewhere over here where war is occurring. The optimal debt is 28%, and the utility player 2 is expecting here in equilibrium is 0.5. So suppose player 2 is going to be limiting her spending to just 49% of her available resources, which, as I just indicated, we can mimic this by taking theta equal 49. It's going to be right here. In this case, the optimal debt would be the peace debt. So the outcome would be peace, essentially. Well, in this case, player 2's payoff would actually be higher than her war payoff. And in fact, player 1's payoff would also be higher. So if player 2 could promise not to increase her resources in equilibrium, they would actually benefit. Both of them would benefit. So it does appear to be a type of commitment problem. The problem is that player 2 cannot credibly commit to do this. Because if player 1 thought that player 2 would mobilize at this lower level, of course he would optimize based on this expectation. He's going to get a distribution of power of 35% in his favor. And then they enter the mobilization phase. This is what they would expect to do in equilibrium. But if now player 2 deviates from her commitment and reneges and decides to mobilize fully, she can improve the distribution of power in her, basically move it in her favor from 35% in favor of player 1 to 21% in favor of player 1. And then this turns out, if you crank through the parameters, it will cause war. But in this war, her payoff would be 0.67, very, very high. So ironically, because full mobilization would give her, under these conditions, where player 1 expects her to limit her mobilization, if she deviates from this, she would get 0.67. Player 2 cannot credibly commit, so she would get only 5.6, and as a result, she only gets 0.5, which is kind of tragic, but it is a type of commitment problem. Okay, but unfortunately, this is not the whole story. Because if you look at other values of the parameter, there is no commitment problem, but war still occurs. So for instance, at theta equal 1, our favorite example here, full mobilization, player 1's war payoff is right here. It is strictly better than the best peace payoff she can ever get. Meaning that she actually has no incentive to try to limit her mobilization because the best she can get in peace is worse when she expects to get in war. This is given the type of debt that player 1 has incurred. So in this case, you cannot possibly argue it's caused by a commitment problem. So what is the caused by that? And as I keep saying, and try to explain again and again, it's borrowing too much is the fundamental problem here. So when you have to repay, if you're committed to repaying your debt in peace or in victory, but not in defeat, you can essentially borrow so much that the peace terms that end in peace are too demanding. Too demanding meaning that player 1's war payoff is so big that she's not willing to make you the concession necessary to enable you to repay the debt. And this is the closure, leads to the closure of the bargaining range. And this is not the way war is caused in our traditional models. So here, the culprit is the inefficient peace. Because borrowing remember I showed you the little equation, makes war even less efficient than into the traditional model. Okay, so that's good. That's kind of should make war even harder. But borrowing also makes peace inefficient. And that's in stark contrast with the traditional model. And a successful peace deal must not only now compensate you for the expected payoff from war, but also for the cost you have incurred in maintaining the peace, right? So you don't go in a fight. And that means, in particular, that if that is a type of sunk cost, so for instance, you're always committed to repaying it no matter what, it's not going to work. It's not going to have this effect, right? There's got to be a difference in the probability of repudiation. In particular, in this case, you have to be more likely to repudiate the debt if you lose the war than in any other scenario. Right? And I show this formally in the paper. But as I said, I thought the assumption that you must repudiate if you lose the war is not actually that onerous, especially looking at the history. So what is the difference between this and the traditional bargaining failure explanation? The traditional assumption is war is the costliest possible dispute resolution mechanism around. And if war is the costliest dispute resolution mechanism, then the bargaining range will never actually be empty. This is even with incomplete information. This is even with commitment problems. So the traditional puzzle is, if the bargaining range is not empty, how come they cannot locate the deals? And that's where you introduce all sorts of other scenarios to explain why, even in the presence of these deals, they cannot actually find them. So either because they cannot commit to upholding them, or because incomplete information gives them incentives to kind of push for deals that are actually outside the bargaining range. Here, if we ask a question about how peace is going to be maintained, you'll notice that peace is costly, and war might not be the most inefficient dispute resolution mechanism anymore. And in this case, the bargaining range itself may not exist. And the new question now is why the bargaining range might close, right? So it's not the question of why you cannot locate a deal in the bargaining range that exists, but why the bargaining range may not exist. And the reason this is interesting is because under the traditional mechanism, we cannot actually explain very well wars of what I call wars of choice. Wars where we both start the war thinking we can do better than what we're prepared to give to each other. With the traditional mechanism, and I go over this at some length in the paper, when the war begins, at least one, but even under some circumstances, both players really regret that they have to fight. And that by the time war begins, there are some cases, for instance, where they both can locate peace deals that they would rather have than fight. This is easiest to see in the traditional setup with the incomplete information over costs, but it holds actually for everything else. So here's the probability of winning for player one, and the bargaining range is usually modeled like this: the maximum cost for player one and the minimum cost for player two. So this is the bargaining range. It always exists, even if you assume uncertainty over the cost. So you don't know whether C1 is here or here. Doesn't matter. C2 is here or here. It doesn't matter. The thing is, this thing always exists. The way war is caused in the usual model is because you may be uncertain where you are, whether the opponent will accept this deal or this deal. You may try to press for stuff outside the range. And under some circumstances, assuming you have the correct extensive form that doesn't allow them to renegotiate, they can end up fighting. But the point is, when they start fighting because this deal was rejected, they both expect to do worse than war than deals that they both know that exist. So it's a war with regret. So the thing is, when the bargaining range does exist, you will not be able, I think, to explain wars of choice. And that is kind of, for a framework that is entirely dependent on choice, is kind of unfortunate. So I thought one way to think about this is to explain why the bargaining range doesn't exist. So then you have a choice, and your choice is to fight and dispute. The war becomes a mutually acceptable dispute resolution mechanism, which is kind of sad. But that was the way I was thinking about this. Now, because somebody there asked about the interest you have to pay to attract that, I had thought of a simple extension of the model where, okay, well, suppose now you have to pay back the money with some interest. What kind of interest rates would you have to offer to attract payment? So I just started, okay, let there be some alternative risk-free rate of return. And in equilibrium, if you're going to be getting stuff from people investing, they should be indifferent between investing there this amount or giving you this amount, given that you might repudiate it. You will only repay it if you win, right? So with probability P, you would win, and D here is the debt servicing schedule. So essentially the interest you have to pay in order to enable them to give you the money. And you just substitute the debt servicing schedule instead of the debt in these expressions, and you find another sufficient condition for war, and it turns out all the results follow. Again, you can find necessary and sufficient conditions for war, and the only difference is that the range of parameters in which war occurs shrinks, because now that becomes more expensive, obviously, so you're not going to be borrowing that much anymore. So I thought about looking about what I call now the coercion premium. What it is that you have to pay over this alternative rate of return in order to attract the borrowing, the lending. And essentially here is 1 plus the whatever, 6% or whatever the alternative risk-free rate of return is. And this here is the relative risk of this investment. This here is the risk of default, and this is the probability that you will actually repay it. So it's a very simple expression.
So, sorry, this is the calculation by a lender who is thinking whether to lend or not to one of the two conflicting parties.
Only player one can borrow here.
Yes.
Yeah, so only for player one. Exactly. So I'm thinking this is your own population and they can invest somewhere else, or they can buy the government bonds. That's the thinking. All right, so as before, we take the similar parameters. This should be 0.85. And I assume, suppose the alternative rate of return is just 6% on your investment. So what happens? Again, as you can see, the dynamics overall are the same. If you're relatively inefficient, peace occurs. If you're relatively inefficient, peace occurs. If you're very efficient, peace occurs. And if you're moderately efficient, war occurs. The range of parameters where war occurs has shrunk, so war becomes harder. And the overall levels of debt is going to be smaller because it's more expensive to borrow now. Now, I thought, okay, well, let's look at the interest payments. Because again, in equilibrium, look, the optimal amount of debt is completely non-monotonic. It's discontinuous and it's non-monotonic. Like here, it's messy. So I thought, well, what about interest payments? And I found to my kind of surprise that interest payments always increase, right? The more inefficient you are, the more you have to pay in interest, even though the amount you borrow might vary in these bizarre ways. And the reason for this, of course, turns out to be the coercive premium, basically the risk of this investment that you have to, that the investment carries, is what happens. So I said, okay, well, if this, perfect, if the optimal debt decreases, as I show in the paper, in the risk-free alternative rate of return, that maybe in a prosperous society where there are many alternatives to invest your money at good rates of return, maybe these would be less likely to go to war. So prosperous countries less likely to fight. Turns out, not that simple. All right, so I said, okay, let's plot the interest rate of return here, and let's see what happens. Again, as before, same sets of parameters. And here I take theta to be this 0.2, so you're relatively efficient. You would have peace if the rate of return is 6%. And notice, unfortunately, and again, we observe non-monotonicity. At very low rates of return, peace prevails. At very high rates of return, peace prevails. At moderate rates of return, war prevails. So what happens? Well, if the rate of return is really low, right, you can easily match it. So you can borrow enough money. And if you borrow enough money, you're kind of relatively efficient at converting it to resources. So it's cheap to borrow. You borrow, you're efficient at converting it, and you can get a good improvement in your payoffs. So as in the original model, you get peace. If the alternative rate is very high, it's very expensive to borrow. It's very difficult to attract these guys to give you the money. So even small amounts are very expensive to you. So even though you're kind of efficient, you have to borrow, you have to offer terms that make it basically impractical for you to borrow. So you wouldn't. Only here does it make sense. So kind of perversely, war turns out to be the curse of the kind of somewhat affluent. If you're very, very poor or very, very rich, it doesn't make sense to fight for different reasons. But if you kind of have the money and you're not very poor or very rich, then you may invest in fighting. Okay, so what are the conclusions? First of all, as I kind of argued, and I do at length in the paper, is that the traditional approach explains only wars that are either imposed by one party on another, or wars that they both wish they didn't have to fight once they begin. And this is troubling for a choice-based framework like the game theoretic framework. So I said, maybe the way to explain a war of choice is just to wipe out the bargaining range. For this, given that we know that if war is the least efficient dispute resolution mechanism, the bargaining range always exists, what we have to do is break that assumption that peace is efficient. This obviously is post-hoc theorizing. This is after I solved the model and found out what's going on. So I'm giving you now the conclusions in this form. And the way to do this is to assume that payment in victory or peace, but repudiation in defeat. And this I can find conditions that lead to the closure of the bargaining range, and that gives us a kind of a new explanation for war based on the type of financing that you use in order to actually expand your resource base for military capabilities. So that's it.
Thank you. What's all about? Now it's time, just don't go away, because you're going to answer questions. So. Barry?
Well, I think it's really interesting in the idea of coming up with this, the whole area of looking at how wars are fought as a way of conflict resolution, or how wars are financed as a way of conflict resolution. I think is really interesting. I had a couple of thoughts, and one is that it reminds me of the producers, and where the only way they could get away with everything is if their play failed, and of course it had an inefficient ending too, because they ended up in prison. But you know, if I were trying to fit this into not to deny anything here, but just if I were trying to fit it into, say, Theron's framework, his notion, right at the start, he says, I'm talking about rational unitary actors. And I'll call it rationalists, because it's more cumbersome to say rational unitary actors. But if there's a bunch of people loaning you money, then you've also gone beyond the rational unitary actor assumption, which is fine. I'm just saying that's how it fit in. But the thing that really bothers me about these models is B. I don't see why they're troubling for choice-based frameworks. I mean, the notion that there's a bargaining range, we have complete information, and we're just fine with making commitments, but still we can't agree on which of the choices in the bargaining range. I mean, I can imagine two people of opposite ends of a bridge, and I want to go first, no, I want to go first. And they never solve it, it's perfectly symmetrical. I don't have any trouble with people who have bargains available, but there's no theorem in game theory that says if you've got bargains available, you're gonna get to one. I mean, Nash's theorem says that on a basis of a bunch of assumptions, but there's no general theorem that says that. And so why is it troubling?
Well, it's troubling for me because, sure, I can see how we agree, here's the set of deals. I think I should get the best one in this set, and you think you should get the best one in this set. But the problem is if we fight, we both are now getting payoffs that are worse from my and from your perspective. So once the fighting begins, we expect to get deals that are worse than even if I had conceded to you the deal you wanted, or even if you had conceded to me the deal you wanted. So the fact that we both go into war thinking, oh gee, maybe I should just call him back and give him this other deal, and I actually have incentives to do so, is troubling. Now, you can make an argument on why this is impossible to sustain an equilibrium, and you may have to have fighting. But again, I want to have, and it probably comes from my reading of history in a way that when they go to war, they don't actually appear to be thinking, oh gee, I could have agreed to that deal, but now I'm kind of committed to fighting. No, they're thinking, I think I can do better than what the guy's willing to give me. And they both think this. So what I really want, and it's just my kind of matter of taste, I guess. I don't have trouble seeing how a game theoretic model can produce these results. Gosh, I've written a bunch of these too, and they produce them exactly under these conditions. But they don't appear, essentially, the one like here, the one I erased, where war is a result of a failed bluff. I mean, it's a stretch. It doesn't strike me like intuitively, and I'm sorry, I'm waving my hands. Obviously, I don't have a scientific criterion. It doesn't strike me as a good explanation for war. It's like, oh, I crossed the line, and oh, damn it, now we have to fight, and it's too bad. Even though, you know, there's a bunch of deals that we can both have. It's just, I guess, a matter of taste. I don't have a proof that I'm correct.
Actually, I have one question and one comment, and the question is sort of minor, so I'll get out of the way first. E there says you break the assumption that peace is efficient. You have a lender in this model who does badly when there's war. So you don't really mean Pareto efficiency there.
No, only from the perspective of the two players.
Okay. Yeah, that's the one question. The comment is there's actually an effect that's a lot like this. It's fairly well known in the industrial economics literature. There's a paper by Brander and Lewis that discusses what's called the limited liability effect in oligopoly, the limited liability effect of debt. So this notion of debt as a pre-commitment with a third party that affects behavior and competition is fairly widely studied in industrial economics and in finance now to some extent. And the basic idea in the IO literature is that if I fund my firm by debt, and I'm, say, a quantity setter, and there'll be a shock to demand after quantities are chosen, then this limited liability effect means basically I don't care about the states of the world where I default. So I set my quantity for the good states of the world. That makes me more aggressive. My best response function shifts out. Because of that, because of the downward sloping best response functions, my rival becomes more passive in equilibrium. And I think there's very much the same type of effect that unilaterally I'd like to incur a positive level of debt because that makes me more aggressive and benefits me in the IO setting and the quantity setting game that arises. Here would be in the bargaining, presumably. But if we both do that, we both become more aggressive. We're worse off than we would be if we could make pre-commitments not to have debt in the first place. And so that's called, in the IO literature, it's called the limited liability effect of debt. And Brander and Lewis wrote some other papers on things like the bankruptcy effect. So for instance, if war breaking out as, say, a bankruptcy of a firm incurred a really bad cost, you got a very, very, very negative payoff, then this type of thing might, you would have to balance that cost against this limited liability effect that makes you more aggressive. But there is this literature there that looks at these third-party commitments as ways of becoming more aggressive and thereby forcing the rival to be more passive in equilibrium. I think something very similar to that is going on.
Yes, but with one exception, is that because of the way, basically, yes, if you incur the debt, you can expand your capabilities, but the real kicker here, for me at least, came from the fact that it may not make the other one passive enough to enable them to actually offer you the concessions you want. So it may actually close the bargaining line. So for me, that was actually the innovation. I'm not aware of this, actually wasn't aware of this literature.
Oh, yeah, right.
But if I'm
So-
kind of forced to make a guess of the difference, that would be it.
Yeah, so there's a discontinuity in the outcome in your model, is
Yeah,
what you're saying.
yeah.
But basically it's the same,
Same
it may
thing.
be in your interest to become more aggressive even if that's the result.
Right, right.
Even though there's that discontinuity.
Yeah.
Right.
All-
Now there is something else going on here, and maybe you can clarify this. This range, usually in these types of models of rivalry, asymmetries in the players can cause strange effects. For instance, it may be the case that if you're relatively weak, by becoming stronger, you are intensifying the competition so much that you end up being worse off. And do I sense something like that? That's
Yes,
going on?
absolutely. In order to get war in equilibrium, one of the players, the pre-war distribution has to favor one of the players sufficiently. If they become more symmetric, essentially everything will mellow out.
Yeah.
They will borrow less and war will not occur. They will agree to peace. Yeah, absolutely.
And that's the question I have, is that why you assume that in lemma 2 or something, they go all the way out?
I don't assume, I prove it.
But you prove it, how do you prove it? Because the thing is that you have y and 1 minus y,
Yeah.
all right? Suppose y is 1/2. And since the total pi is 1, right, in the next phase, in Nash equilibrium, you will never expend more than 1/2 of the total. So
because
that's the question.
I ignore it because that's why I keep saying I do not look at the consumption in the first period. Essentially the cost of the mobilization. I can't use this mouse.
So
Let me just
you assume that all of the initial allocation has to be paid.
Can be paid. Doesn't have to be, but you can pay it. You
But
just limit
there
it
is
by your
something-
resource constraint.
But you're assuming that you consume it before you actually go and negotiate or something. So
You don't
because-
consume in the first phase. You just have your resources.
Yeah, I understand you don't consume, but why would you spend everything? That's not the normal outcome of these games.
Yes, because as I'm explaining is because you would spend, and actually I don't think it will actually change much of the stuff over here. Let me just show you the payoffs.
Because that's the impetus for
Because
borrowing.
here, look at the piece payoffs. You don't pay for you basically have ignored your payoff in the first period, which is where you would incur the cost of this.
Yeah, it's sunk costs. I understand that
Yeah.
they are sunk costs.
So why wouldn't you spend as much as you can initially?
Well,
Here.
because you could have some of the Y left. afterwards, to consume afterwards.
Right, and because I ignore that part in the first period, I don't care.
Okay,
So
that's
if I
the-
put it, my point
So-
is that if I put it and you make the second period count for enough, you'll get
Okay.
the same thing.
All right, so that's sort of an issue that, okay, so that's, you ignore that before,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
so that's, the intuition then is that it's like, Dan has a paper about different litigation systems. If you have your opponent can pay, basically part of the litigation costs can be part of the bargaining range, it's similar result, isn't it? So the D goes into the common pool of bargaining, and you pay only a sort of portion of it. And so that's what reduces the bargaining range in your sort of framework. Plus the fact that we have the sunk costs. Everything else is sunk cost except this one.
Yeah, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So,
One more question. That's
I will hog the last question.
Yes. So you give basically an overall picture that's, you could describe the overall picture as saying that the availability of outside lenders because it creates a new reason for war, is bad. But you could also think about other reasons why the availability of outside lenders is good. For example, if there is a lingering conflict and the availability of money for let's say the potential winner of this conflict will shorten shorten the war, because with the outside money the winner wins immediately and you kill less people. So my question is, what do we know empirically or historically is can you say that there is evidence that the availability of outside lenders is bad for war?
I have to say that this is something that I have started doing because I have to collect the data, so I do not know. But I would say that here the availability of outside lenders is not bad from player one's perspective. He's quite happy that he has access to this under certain conditions. So yeah, sure, it increases the probability of war, but it enables him to get both better peaceful deals, and if war breaks out, he does much better in war too. So I'm not sure I would make an unequivocal commitment to the statement that it's always bad. It's bad from if you don't like war, which we don't.
But,
Yeah, from a social
perspective.
Yeah.